Everyone. I suggest that you watch the Act Utilitarianism lecture video if you have not, and know that material, because I'm going to use that. I'm going to assume that you know that material in this lecture. So here we go with Rule Utilitarianism. So remember, I ended the Act Utilitarianism video with look, sometimes it's just really hard to make decisions and figure out what the right thing to do, just trying to, calculate the good consequences, the utility, right? So one thing that you want to think about as a rule utilitarianism is look, when we look at certain practices and certain rules over time, they've shown to produce great utility, right? Like do not commit murder and do not lie, right? Or do not cheat. These things over time have produced great utility. So it may be better to follow these rules than any individual act in trying to figure it out, right? So we can kind of respect individual rights. We can think about principles of justice and thinking about minority views and minorities, including them, and it's just easier to follow. So here are kind of a couple of principles that rule utilitarianism follows. One is that a morally right rule or practice is one which, if widely followed, would produce more overall utility than if there were no such rule or practice. So notice the rules are not based because it's, God says so, or it's the rational thing to do, or whatever. It's because following these rules produces the best results in terms of utility. And any act, right, a moral act is what is morally right, is what a morally right rule or practice does, right? So if I don't lie, any particular time I don't lie not because of that act itself, but because it's associated with the, rule of not lying, right? That's the thing that produces the greatest utility over time. Okay, so here's some advantages. It's like Act utilitarianism in many ways, right? It's objective, it's impartial, it's fairly simple, and it can extend to non-human animals, and also avoids the calculation problem, right? I don't have to constantly think of what move to make next, what action would produce the greatest utility. I just follow the rule, right? And I don't have to calculate, because I trust that the rule over time historically has shown to have the greatest utility. All right, so another kind of advantage is that Act utilitarianism sometimes, it requires that we go beyond the call of duty, right? It's over demanding. Rule utilitarianism could, sometimes it may be a little easier sometimes because we just follow a particular rule. And in a particular situation, we may, it's going to be different than Act utilitarianism, right? Because the general rule may not apply to everyone. So for example, here's giving 40% to or more to charity. Now to someone like Bill Gates, giving 40%, which he has done, and he's doing wonderful work, is feasible and it's wonderful, right? But he has billions left, right? Now, we can't make that into something that everyone can do, right? We can't. If we made that practice by everyone, then people in poverty, they couldn't give 40%, right? Because then it would be below that, right? So it may ultimately have more disutility than utility if we made a particular act in a particular situation into the rule. So what do? Usually a rule utilitarian will find the best general rule that will bring about the greatest utility, not something so specific like this, right? So it may be giving 5% or something like that, right? Or maybe it will be a rule based on different categories of people or something like that and their income. All right. So it also makes progress with the moral permissiveness objection. Remember that with Act utilitarianism, it seems like even you can justify torturing or assassinating people if it would bring greatest utility in a particular situation. Now, that makes anything permissible, right? That seems to rub the wrong way. It goes against our moral intuition, right? Our moral confirmation. So, rule utilitarian says no, like breaking promises, or it can be against assassinating people, etc., or torture. Why? Because if we don't do these things, overall, over time and overall utility is greater. Although maybe in a particular situation, assassinating someone or torturing someone may bring about better utility. We're after the long game with rule utilitarianism, not the short game. Rule utilitarianism also appears to make progress with the justice or human rights objection, right? So remember that with act utilitarianism, you could, for example, force organ donations, right? You can violate human rights, right? Because why? The majority utility, or the greatest good for the greatest number, is what matters. But what about the rights of the minority? Or the one, remember chop up Chuck, right? So these kinds of issues, rule utilitarianism could say, look, they forbid any of these practices because it would be unjust and violate human rights if such of these practices would not promote utility, right? So with chop up Chuck, where you get a guy going to a hospital for a sprained ankle, but his organs are harvested for 5 other people, and he dies, obviously, but 5 people are alive and promote greater utility. Well, no, what would happen if that was a normal practice? Would people start going to the hospital for stuff? No, they would avoid the hospital, right? And what would happen? No one would go to the hospital, people would get sick, and maybe there would be greater disutility than utility. So a rule utilitarian could easily say, no, we follow the rule that we don't do these things. We uphold human rights and uphold the rights of minorities and minority positions. Why? Because overall, if we follow this rule, there's greater utility. Okay, that's the idea. How about problems with rule utilitarianism? Well, there's the dilemma object. Okay, so what does this mean? Basically, because rules can conflict with each other, rule utilitarians can produce moral dilemmas, and in a dilemma, no matter what I choose to do, I still violate some rule. So, Nazis are at your door. You're hiding Jews in the attic. Do you save lives or tell a lie? Because that's what the Nazis are asking you, right? They're saying, do you have Jews in your house? And if you lie, you save the lives. If you don't, then the lives of the Jews in your attic are probably going to be forfeited, right? So, which rule do you follow? And so the rule utilitarian could say, well, okay, we'll have a dilemma principle. So in circumstances where 2 or more utilitarian rules conflict, then the morally right act for these particular circumstances is that which will produce the greatest amount of overall utility in, right? So you follow the rule that produces the greater. So is there like a disutility involved? Sure. If you lie and save the lives of the Jews in your attic, lying produces disutility, but the utility in saving lives is higher, so overall you have overall utility. That's a way that you could kind of that the rule utilitarian could respond. How about there's the inconsistency objection, and this is the right act for act utilitarian is always that act that achieves the greatest overall utility in a situation. So in that very same situation, the right act for rule utilitarianism is that act which obeys an applicable rule, even if a different act would create a greater overall utility in that situation. What's the point here? That is, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism could be inconsistent. Act utilitarianism could promote doing action A in this circumstance, but rule utilitarianism is action B by following a rule. So isn't this an inconsistency, right? So this failure of rule utilitarian to promote the greatest overall utility is said to be inconsistent with the utilitarian concept of morality, right? So maybe this particular act would produce more utility, but isn't that inconsistent with what the rule utilitarian is trying to get at? Well, they could say, look, we're trying to follow the best overall long-term goals here, right? So establishing utility-producing rules and practices creates more utility than we can create by simply following act utilitarianism. So what they can do is they can fine-tune or to improve the rule utilitarian rules so that if they're in a situation where it seems clearly greater that the act utilitarian would get, that way of going about it would produce more utility, then they can tweak the rules a little bit, okay? What's the problem? What's another problem? So another problem is what's called the collapse problem or the collapse objection. So basically, when you're fine-tuning each rule, that can go really far, and it will go so far as that it will collapse into act utilitarianism. What do you mean? So let me give you an example. Let's say we say do not lie as a rule. But, we have the Nazi and Jews in your attic example, right? So we're going to have to change the rule and say it's something like, do not lie except in cases where you can save human lives. So do not lie except in situations like A. But you know what? There's going to be other circumstances where lying is beneficial, right? Not only saving Jews in your attic, but what if it's going to, do X, Y, and Z, something else. So then you go, okay, well, do not lie except in cases A or B. Well, then we find out in a situation that lying may be acceptable. So you say, well, do not lie except in A, B, or C. But notice we can go etc., etc., and it just becomes like 10 pages long, right? This rule with all the exceptions. Well, if you think about it, doesn't this just collapse rule utilitarianism back into act utilitarianism? If we're going to make all these exceptions, it seems like you're making an exception for every single circumstance. Doesn't that mean that you're just doing act utilitarianism? For any particular act, do the thing that promotes the greatest utility. So maybe rule utilitarian is just a kind of another way of being an act utilitarian. It just collapses there. Well, maybe. Okay. How about problems with the, remember that rule utilitarianism seemed to account for justice and human rights better than act utilitarianism, because they could have a rule that says don't, to give individual rights, promote individual rights, promote the rights of minority positions and minorities. Why? Because overall it creates better utility. Well, what if, so remember like chop up Chuck, right? So chop up Chuck is wrong, and that's why that was an objection to act utilitarianism, right? Chuck goes into a hospital with a sprained ankle. We can't just chop him up and give his organs to people, right? Because that would be wrong. He has individual rights. So maybe we could fine tune it though, right? So we fine tune that maybe because, couldn't we get a rule that kind of will squeeze out even more utility? Like healthy persons who have no family or friends, who are on welfare, and who offer little promise of ever contributing to society should have their organs harvested when that can save the lives of a number of other people. So the healthy, depressed hermit really is not producing any utility. So wouldn't it be okay to harvest there? I mean, this rule, couldn't we follow this rule? And that seems to be like, first of all, it seems against individual human rights. Yes. But then the reason why, remember that rule utilitarian can't talk about human rights because it's right in and of itself. They always have to talk about human rights because it produces the greatest utility, right? The greatest good for the greatest number. But if we have an example like this, where it's a hermit, healthy hermit, the greatest utility would be to harvest their organs, right? So they're talk about, oh, individual rights. No, this can be consistently, because this is going to be a smaller number of people, right? And we can just harvest their organs, and that seems a problem. So rule utilitarianism still has a problem with justice issues, because we could always come up with like the healthy hermit or the minorities that would not produce as much utility when compared to the majority if we took advantage of them, right? So rule utilitarians could respond, though, look, following basic human rights has more utility, right? Because look, over time it's better, even for the healthy hermit, we can't harvest there, because if people know about it, then it's going to promote fear. They can kind of spin that kind of story. That's just kind of the basics of rule utilitarianism. I just want you to kind of get familiar with the reasoning process, how they think through things, because that's going to help you to think through things. All right. Okay, I hope this was helpful, and I'll see you online.